Most people recognize the names Rockefeller or Vanderbilt, but there was one man even they whispered about as Mephistopheles, the devil himself, a man who turned Wall Street into his private casino and nearly decapitated the American economy just to turn a profit. His name was Jay Gould. The press branded him the poison spider of Wall Street, yet he spent his quiet nights tenderly grooming fragile orchids. He was the man who triggered the Black Friday collapse, pocketing millions while the nation spiraled into ruin, only to return home to a townhouse so modest it defied belief. Picture this: Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America, is frantically throwing millions of dollars into the market to devour a railroad. But inside a dimly lit room, a thin, frail man with ice in his veins is doing something unthinkable. He is simply printing more paper. The more money Vanderbilt pours in, the faster this man cranks the press. It was a dark alchemy that transformed his enemy's vast fortune into worthless scrap. Welcome to the life of the most hated genius in financial history. Unlike the flashy Rockefeller or the commanding J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould was a true ghost, a player who treated the law as a mere suggestion and morality as a variable that could be cut from the ledger. Today, we aren't just telling a history story, we are dissecting the brain of the man who fundamentally hacked the game of capitalism. We will learn how a penniless farm boy used mathematics, cunning, and a touch of dark magic to bring the United States to its knees. Fasten your seatbelts. This is how Jay Gould owned the world. Imagine a world choked, not just by the smoke of industry, but by the relentless ambition of men. The year is 1836. The air in upstate New York, far from the rising financial hum of Manhattan, smells overwhelmingly of pine and damp earth. Here, in the sleepy, unpaved hamlet of Roxbury, nestled deep in Delaware County, a boy named Jason Gould drew his first breath. He was born into the 1830s, a decade where America was still more frontier than future, where the clatter of a horse-drawn wagon was the loudest sound, and where pedigree was worthless compared to relentless, calculated drive. Jay, as he would soon be known, was not born into the silk sheets of the Astors. Yet he wasn't starving in a shack either. His father, a respected local figure, valued education enough to send him to private academies. But for a boy with a mind like a diamond cutter, the slow, debt-ridden rhythms of Roxbury felt like a cage. He didn't just want to survive the land. He wanted to calculate its value, map its potential, and sell it to the highest bidder. It was from this unremarkable patch of Delaware County dirt that the man who would one day make Wall Street shiver first began to plot his escape. Jason Gould was born on May 27th, 1836, the fifth of 6 children to John Burr Gould and Mary Moore. John Gould was a farmer, but one utterly stripped of pastoral romance, a man perpetually worn thin, locked in a brutal, silent war with soil that perpetually seemed to resent his efforts. The Goulds were not poor enough to starve, but they were certainly too indebted to rest. Their farm was less a home and more a battlefield against nature's cold indifference. Withered crops, cows that refused to give milk, and the relentless creep of loan repayments. Mary, Jay's mother, was the fragile anchor holding the family together, a woman of quiet, often hidden strength, who managed the chaos of the household while her husband wrestled with the ever-tightening noose of debt. But stability proved temporary. When Jay was only 4 years old, Mary's frail health gave way, and she died. Her absence left a palpable, gaping void, a primal lesson in vulnerability that the sharp-eyed boy registered acutely. One might expect a child orphaned early and raised on a failing farm to become merely another calloused hand, destined for the plow. But Jay was fundamentally different. Even in infancy, he carried a spark, an almost unnerving restlessness that separated him from his siblings. His sisters often noted his small, almost delicate frame, contrasting sharply with his dark, piercing eyes that seemed to possess the unnerving ability to see through people, assessing motives before words were even spoken. He avoided the rough and tumble of farm life, opting instead to spend hours meticulously copying numbers into whatever scrap paper he could salvage, obsessively seeking order in the world's chaos. His father, sensing the boy was ill-suited for the endless cycles of planting and harvest, made a pivotal decision. He enrolled Jay in the local one-room schoolhouse. It was a cramped space, smelling perpetually of chalk dust, wood smoke, and damp wool, It was here that Jay's nascent mind truly began to sharpen, treating education not as a chore, but as a strategic exercise. He was smaller and younger than most of his farm boy classmates, who often targeted him for his quick, cutting intelligence and refusal to back down. A story from his early adolescence crystallizes the tactics that would define his entire career. A hulking farm boy, intent on asserting physical dominance, shoved Jay into the muddy dirt after school. The conventional response would have been tears or retreat. Instead, Jay calmly rose, dusted off his threadbare coat, and waited. The next day, he carefully slipped a live, non-venomous snake into the bully's desk. The resulting pandemonium, the screams, the toppled furniture, the teacher's fury earned Jay a severe whipping, but it also earned him something far more valuable than temporary pain: respect. He understood that physical confrontation was for the dull-witted. Jay fought with cunning, misdirection, and psychological leverage. That was Jay Gould at 10 years old. But as the ink dried on his schoolroom ledgers, the walls of the one-room schoolhouse began to feel like a cage for a mind that moved faster than the local curriculum. Jay knew that respect in Roxbury was a small prize. The real theater of power was being constructed elsewhere, far beyond the quiet dairy farms of Delaware County. By his early teens, Jay's conceptual world was expanding far beyond Roxbury's muddy borders. The 1840s were convulsing America, transforming it from an agrarian republic into a nascent industrial powerhouse. The Erie Canal had already repositioned New York as the continental commercial artery, and the first iron tentacles of the railroad were beginning to snake across the landscape, promising a future where distance was no longer destiny. Jay, now a lanky teenager with dark, scrutinizing eyes, was utterly consumed by this seismic shift. He would walk miles just to watch surveyors at work, their chains and theodolites appearing like instruments of prophecy. He was fascinated by geometry, algebra, and the precise, predictable language of measurement. At 14, he secured a clerking job at a local general store. His motive was not the paltry pennies he earned, but the unrestricted access it granted him to the store's ledgers and balance sheets. While other boys daydreamed of whaling ships and Western adventure, Jay dreamed of double-entry accounting. Yet, his path was not one of preordained genius. His father's farm was collapsing, and by age 15, the family faced total ruin. John Gould's debts were piling up, and creditors were circling like vultures preparing for a feast. Jay, who had been struggling to keep the family's books afloat, understood the stark arithmetic. The numbers represented a death sentence for the life his father had struggled to build. He decided to preempt the ruin. He had heard of Oliver Burroughs, a surveyor mapping land for the relentless railroad expansion. Jay, barely old enough to shave, walked 20 hard miles to Burroughs' office and, with characteristic nerve, demanded a job. Burroughs, perhaps amused by the boy's audacity, hired him as an assistant. The work was brutal. Jay hauled heavy transit equipment through dense forests and fetid swamps, battled swarms of mosquitoes, and slept rough under the stars. But it was also a revelation. Surveying was not merely measuring acreage. It was about charting the future. It revealed exactly where the railroads would run, where the boomtowns would inevitably rise, and, most crucially, where the vast streams of money would soon flow. Jay absorbed everything, learning not just the technical skill of the compass, but the strategic skill of reading the ambitions of men. By 16, his drafting was so meticulous, his maps so precise, they rivaled those produced by men twice his age. And here, the hustler emerged. Jay didn't just work for Burroughs, he exploited the position. He began selling his own highly detailed, proprietary maps to local speculators and farmers, pocketing a few crucial dollars on the side. This small, secret revenue stream was his first true taste of profit, and it was deeply intoxicating. However, Jay was not content to merely map the fortunes of other men. He realized that while a surveyor could see the future, only a proprietor could own it. His meticulous maps had shown him not just land, but the strategic value of resources, and he began searching for a venture where his analytical mind could leverage someone else's capital to build an empire of his own. The opportunity arrived when his path crossed with a man whose reputation was as large as his bank account. By the time Jay Gould reached 70, he had shed Roxbury like a snakeskin. The small, sickly boy who relied on cunning to dodge bullies was now a lanky young man equipped with a surveyor's laser-like focus and a hustler's relentless heart. The year was 1853. Jay, with his savings accumulated from his map-selling side hustle, a small fortune for a farm boy, decided to take his first genuine swing at the world of commerce. He strategically partnered with Zadok Pratt, a wealthy, established tanner and local politician. Pratt, older, respected, and flush with capital, represented everything Jay lacked in reputation. But Jay possessed the critical asset Pratt lacked, a mind that perceived strategic angles where others saw only straight lines. The plan was to build a state-of-the-art tannery in Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania, strategically located amidst thick stands of hemlock whose bark was essential for curing leather. Jay convinced Pratt to provide the full bankroll, promising to personally oversee the entire construction and operation. Jay was utterly devoid of tanning expertise, yet he had nerve. And at this stage, nerve trumped knowledge. At 18, he relocated to Lackawaxen, a peaceful valley where the air smelled intensely of pine sap and chemical impossibility. He threw himself into the project, overseeing construction, managing the labor force, and, critically, keeping the books. The facility, grandly named Goldsboro, was his first true independent venture. But the murkiness began almost immediately. Jay wasn't content merely to manage. He was learning how to play the financial shell game. He kept the records meticulously, perhaps too meticulously. Rumors soon began to circulate among the hired hands and local suppliers that not all the numbers were adding up. Whispers suggested Jay was systematically skimming profits, funneling money into private accounts, while Pratt's investment bore the brunt of the overhead. The documentation of Goldsboro is long lost, and Jay never confessed to the larceny. But Pratt, a man accustomed to being the sharpest observer in any room, soon detected the distinct scent of a rat. By 1856, the partnership was violently disintegrating. Pratt leveled accusations of outright mismanagement and financial theft. Jay, ever the smooth operator, claimed he was simply misunderstood, and that Pratt failed to grasp the innovative accounting methods. The exact truth was likely somewhere in the middle, but Jay was certainly not handing out apologies. Pratt, leveraging his deep pockets and political influence, forced Jay out. The tannery was liquidated, and Jay walked away with a few $1,000s, far more than he'd ever possessed, but not enough to call the venture a clean victory. For almost anyone else, the Goldsboro fiasco would have been a humiliating, crushing defeat. Jay, however, viewed it purely as tuition. He had paid dearly, but he had mastered essential skills: how to charm a wealthy backer, how to operate a complex business, and, most importantly, how to secure his own parachute when the partnership inevitably imploded. It was in Lackawaxen that Jay made a crucial connection: a local financier named Charles Loop, who had strong ties to the burgeoning financial district in Manhattan. Loop saw in Jay that same glint of reckless, calculating ambition that Pratt had catastrophically underestimated. When the tannery collapsed, Loop offered Jay a lifeline: a job in New York City. As the dust settled on the ruins of Goldsboro, Jay realized that the hills of Pennsylvania were too small for the scale of his ambition. He didn't just need a new business, he needed a new stage. With Charles Loop's invitation acting as a compass, Jay turned his back on the pine-scented valleys, trading the honest toil of the land for the calculated chaos of the city. In 1856, at the pivotal age of 20, Jay left the rural quietude behind. He arrived in Manhattan, armed with a surveyor's obsessive precision, a tanner's scars, and a hunger that felt almost predatory. New York in the late 1850s was a city of stark contradictions, a sensory chaos of horse manure, diamond stickpins, and raw, unrestrained ambition. The rudimentary stock market was less a regulated institution and more a high-stakes, unregulated casino. Jay, sharp-elbowed and sharper-minded, fit the ecosystem perfectly. Loop introduced him to the world of high finance, initially as a mere clerk, a nobody crunching figures in a dimly lit back office. But Jay was there to learn. He watched the cycles of panic and triumph, observing that the stock market was merely a reflection of human greed, fear, and, most importantly, power. The power to bend or break rules in one's own favor. In a strange diversion during this intense period, Jay began compiling and writing a comprehensive history of Delaware County, his forgotten home turf, published in 1856. The book was a dense, factual catalog of local families, land deals, and corn yields. It was hardly a bestseller, but it served multiple purposes, establishing a thin veneer of scholarly legitimacy, keeping his name in print, and proving he could spin a narrative, even one revolving around county lines and agricultural statistics. But while Gould was busy crafting a respectable past for himself in print, the American present was beginning to fracture under its own weight, preparing a brutal crucible for his newly forged city life. As Jay found his footing, the country around him began to strain. The 1850s were fraught with tension. Abolitionist debates tore at the national fabric, and the economy wobbled precariously under the weight of excessive speculation. Then, in 1857, the financial panic struck, triggered by the collapse of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. Stocks plummeted, businesses shuttered overnight, and men who had considered themselves untouchable were suddenly facing ruin. For the majority, it was a cataclysm. For Jay Gould, it was a definitive, real-time education. He saw how rapidly established fortunes could evaporate, how panic could transform otherwise rational men into terrified sheep. And he saw, above all, the blinding white flash of opportunity. In the ensuing market chaos, Jay dipped his savings into stocks, buying desperately low, mastering the volatile rhythms of a market that rewarded the boldest and the most ruthless. By the close of the 1850s, Jay was fundamentally remade. He was no longer the boy from Roxbury. He was a young man with a modest cash reserve, a small network of influential contacts, and a mind that never ceased its calculations. He had survived the tannery, navigated a major financial collapse, and established himself in the city that would ultimately define him. But the real game, the colossal, wealth-defining game, was just beginning. The railroads, the iron arteries that pumped the wealth of a continent, were calling his name. It is 1860. Jay Gould, 24 years old, a wiry young man with an ascetic demeanor, is navigating the volatile, shark-infested waters of Manhattan's financial district. The shadow of the looming Civil War darkens the nation, but in the financial capitals, the relentless conversation centers on railroads, great, iron beasts promising to stitch the fractured country together. Jay, with his unparalleled knack for spotting the future, is about to plunge headlong into the most brutal business in America. This is no longer simply about accumulation. It is about absolute control, deception, and building a legacy synonymous with financial ruthlessness. In the 1860s, railroads were the nexus of industrial power. They transported everything: goods, capital, people, turning obscure water stops into burgeoning boomtowns and creating instant millionaires. But the railroad business itself was a quagmire of unchecked speculation, corruption, and outright corporate malfeasance. Companies often issued mountains of stock unsupported by any real assets. Politicians were cheap commodities, secured by bribes to grant essential rights of way, and executives routinely engaged in self-dealing, looting their own treasuries for personal profit. Into this moral vacuum stepped Jay Gould, a man who had already learned in Lackawaxen that rules were often merely suggestions waiting to be broken. His entry into the railroad sphere was far from glamorous. He started as a small-time investor, pouring his savings into struggling, unloved lines such as the Rutland and Washington Railroad. These were not the prestigious transcontinental giants. They were regional roads, often tottering on the edge of bankruptcy, their tracks rattling and their locomotives coughing smoke. But Jay saw profound value in the wreckage. A failing railroad wasn't a liability. It was cheap clay waiting to be shaped. His method was simple and systematic. Buy shares at rock bottom, charm or intimidate his way onto the board of directors, and then execute his specific brand of magic, slashing costs, manipulating the ledgers, or simply flipping the revitalized operation for an immense profit. One of his first major victories was with the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad. Jay, now backed by his old mentor Charles Loop, acquired a significant position during the 1860 panic when the stock was virtually worthless. Where others saw a sinking ship, Jay saw a distressed asset. He seized control, dramatically cut expenses, cheaper coal, tighter schedules, and forced the line into profitability within months. Whispers of watered stock soon followed. Jay inflated the company's capital by issuing new shares without increasing assets, effectively diluting existing shareholders to raise fast cash. It skirted legality, but it was the kind of move that prompted rivals to instinctively check their pockets after sharing a room with Jay. In the midst of this professional ascent, Jay, perhaps seeking an anchor for his chaotic professional life, married Helen Day Miller in 1863. Helen, the daughter of a prominent New York merchant, was not a glittering debutante. She was reserved, intensely practical, and fiercely loyal, the ideal psychological counterweight for a man whose personal charm was utterly cold and calculated. Their marriage, while lacking ostentation, was strategic. Helen's family provided critical social connections, and her dowry certainly did not hurt. They would go on to raise 6 children, and Helen served as Jay's unwavering domestic anchor while he waged his financial wars on Wall Street. With a stable home and a growing reputation for turning scrap iron into gold, Jay was no longer a shadow in the back office. He had become a figure that the established giants of Wall Street could no longer ignore. By the mid-1860s, Jay had forged a name for himself, though not one associated with honor. He captured the attention of true titans, men like Daniel Drew, a legendary cattle drover turned financier, who was renowned for his slippery, almost fraudulent stock manipulation. Drew, a self-proclaimed master of market chaos, recognized in Jay a younger, hungrier reflection of himself, and the two formed a deeply cynical, profitable alliance. Drew brought Jay into the orbit of the Erie Railroad, a sprawling, hopelessly mismanaged giant connecting New York to the Great Lakes. The Erie was a disaster zone of accumulating debt and decaying infrastructure, yet it was also the ultimate prize. Control of the Erie meant control over trade routes across the Northeast. Jay joined the Erie's board of directors in 1867, not as a reformer, but as a systematic predator. The Erie was already a battlefield, with Drew and his associates actively looting it from the inside. But Jay was never content to be a mere sidekick. He began quietly amassing Erie stock, building a position of leverage. He rapidly internalized the dark arts of high finance, short selling, orchestrating stock corners, and using insider information to preempt and destroy rivals. The Erie became his brutal, accelerated training ground, yet every predator eventually meets a larger one. And Jay's mastery of the Erie soon placed him directly in the path of a behemoth who held more weight in America than the entire population of Roxbury. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the wealthiest man in America. Vanderbilt was transitioning his empire from steamboats to railroads, and he required the Erie to complete his coastal to interior monopoly. He was not accustomed to hearing the word no. By 1868, Vanderbilt was aggressively buying Erie stock, intending to seize total control. Jay, Drew, and their third ally, Jim Fisk, a flamboyant, champagne-swilling showman, famous for his garish taste and reckless bravado, had very different plans. The ensuing confrontation, the infamous Erie War, would become one of the most brazen, chaotic, and legally dubious chapters in Wall Street history. Before the fireworks truly began, one detail underscores Jay's mindset. During these early railroad years, he developed the habit of constantly carrying a small, worn leather notebook. It was not used for notes on philosophy or family matters, but for raw, quantifiable data. Stock prices, current freight rates, the precise cost of bribing a key state legislator. His pen moved ceaselessly, charting his ambition like a seismograph. That notebook was the physical manifestation of a mind that never stopped calculating, a mind that viewed the world as a complex chessboard where every single move was designed to set up the ultimate checkmate. And in 1868, with Vanderbilt's millions closing in, Jay Gould was about to make his most audacious, defining move. The clash was no longer a matter of if, but when. As Vanderbilt began his aggressive sweep of Erie shares, the air in Manhattan grew thick with the scent of an impending corporate execution. But the Commodore had made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed his opponents would play by the established rules of the House. The year is 1868. Jay Gould is 32, fully immersed in the treacherous environment of high finance. He is no longer the scrappy surveyor. He is a formidable player, seated at the Erie Railroad's table, shoulder to shoulder with financial predators like Daniel Drew and the theatrical Jim Fisk. The Erie is the prize, a massive, sprawling network capable of making or annihilating colossal fortunes. But the shadow of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the iron-willed Commodore who owned the very table upon which they played, loomed large. What unfolded was not merely a business dispute. It was a scorched earth financial war that ensured Jay Gould's name would forever be synonymous with American greed. The stage was set by the Erie's inherent weakness. Its tracks linked New York City to the crucial Great Lakes region, transporting vital commodities. But its stock was an unstable mess, perpetually manipulated by insiders like Drew, who had long inflated the company's capital or watered the stock to line his own pockets. Jay, now a director, had perfected the technique. He wasn't seeking profit. He was seeking total, unquestioned control. Vanderbilt, aiming to integrate the Erie into his burgeoning national monopoly, bought shares aggressively, driving the price upward and expecting the lesser men to fold. But Jay, Drew, and Fisk refused to capitulate. They orchestrated a plan so brazen it bordered on financial parody. They began printing massive quantities of new Erie stock. Tens of thousands of shares were conjured seemingly out of the thin mountain air of Lackawaxen. A clear, flagrant fraud, though one conveniently murky under the era's corporate law. The objective was simple: flood the market, dilute Vanderbilt's rapidly acquired stake, and make it statistically impossible for him to gain control. To fuel this share printing spree, they needed cash, and Jay executed his old tannery tricks, selling bonds, juggling the company's books, and securing quick, temporary loans. They also required physical sanctuary, knowing that Vanderbilt was not merely a businessman, but a legal force of nature with judges and lawyers already in his pocket. The ensuing chaos was pure theater. Vanderbilt, realizing he was being tricked, secured a New York judge's injunction ordering the Erie trio to cease issuing new shares. Jay, Drew, and Fisk didn't just ignore the order. They openly mocked it. They packed up the essential books and fled across the Hudson River to Jersey City, seeking sanctuary outside New York's jurisdiction. They established their headquarters in a dilapidated, hastily secured establishment known as Taylor's Castle, a name better suited to a pirate's den than a corporate office. Inside those damp walls, the air hummed not with the sound of luxury, but with the rhythmic clatter of a printing press that labored long into the night, signaling a defiance that no judge's gavel could silence. Picture the scene: the quiet, intense Jay Gould, the boisterous, gaudily dressed Jim Fisk, and the perpetually praying, deceitful Daniel Drew, holed up in a Jersey hotel, frantically churning out fresh stock certificates as if they were printing national currency. The Erie War escalated into an absurdity. Vanderbilt kept buying the stock, pouring millions into the market, oblivious that Jay and his Confederates were dumping new shares faster than he could possibly acquire them. The stock price became a dizzying, volatile monstrosity, soaring and crashing multiple times a day, leaving Wall Street traders paralyzed. Simultaneously, Jay initiated a second, equally important campaign: political bribery. He and Fisk began pouring thousands of dollars into the coffers of New York legislators, aiming to purchase laws that would retroactively legalize their fraudulent stock scheme. They directed large sums to figures like Boss Tweed, the infamous king of Tammany Hall, the political machine capable of manufacturing or destroying state laws with a single nod. It wasn't just vague payments. The corruption was visceral. Accounts describe Gould personally arriving in Albany with a suitcase stuffed with $500,000 in greenbacks, roughly $7 million today, handing out cash so freely that the investigating committee earned the nickname the Moonshine Legislature. Then, where senators reportedly took bribes from both Vanderbilt and Gould, only to vote for the highest bidder. It was corruption so open, so flawlessly executed. It bordered on dark artistry, yet this war had a devastating human cost. While Jay outmaneuvered Vanderbilt, thousands of smaller investors, shopkeepers, farmers, and retired couples who had placed their modest savings into Erie stock watched their capital rapidly vanish as the shares were diluted into worthlessness. Jay, however, showed no visible sign of losing sleep over their fate. He was too preoccupied with the constant calculation of his next strategic move. One bizarre anecdote from this period exemplifies the surreal atmosphere. During the high-stakes chess match of the Erie War, a peculiar rumor circulated among the brokers that Jay Gould had retained the services of a professional clairvoyant to predict the capricious movements of stock prices. Was this true? In all likelihood, no. Gould relied on ledgers, not spirits. Yet, the persistence of the tale cemented his legend. It was the kind of story that cleaved itself to Jay Gould, a figure who seemed to operate outside the predictable laws of economics, capable of bending reality itself to his will. By mid-1868, the frenzied war for the Erie had reached a decisive, chaotic climax. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, a man used to dictating terms to generals and senators, found himself decisively outplayed by the younger, more nimble mind of Gould. He was, by all accounts, thunderous with rage, but the Commodore was nothing if not pragmatic. He summoned Jay and his remaining crew, Jim Fisk included, not for surrender, but for a grudging negotiation. The agreement they forged was a masterstroke of costly compromise. Vanderbilt stipulated he would cease his legal and financial attacks, but only if Gould and his allies agreed to buy back the Commodore's holding of Erie stock at an exorbitant premium. This required the Erie ring to raise millions it simply did not possess, plunging them into deeper debt. However, the maneuver accomplished Jay's singular objective. It preserved his control over the railroad and solidified his position as a power broker. Meanwhile, Daniel Drew, the slippery old opportunist, sensing the shifting sands and smelling the odor of debt, quietly liquidated his shares and vanished into the anonymity of retirement, leaving the unlikely duo of Jay Gould and Jim Fisk alone to run the besieged Erie show. But as the smoke cleared and the ledgers were balanced, it became evident that Gould had achieved more than just a financial escape. He had redefined the very nature of corporate conflict, turning the heavy cannons of his enemy against themselves. This victory teaches a timeless lesson in what business strategists now call asymmetric warfare. Vanderbilt tried to win with brute force and superior capital, but Gould changed the mechanics of the game itself. He proved that when you are outgunned, you don't fight harder. You find a loophole, in this case, a printing press, and exploit it until your opponent's strength becomes his weakness. For Gould, this was a resounding triumph, but it came wrapped in a stark warning. The eyes of the nation were now fixed upon him, and not all were applauding. The Erie War had catapulted Jay Gould into the realm of legend, but it was the legend of a shadow king, a figure you feared but certainly wouldn't invite to dinner. Newspapers, unable to deny his sheer brilliance, still excoriated his methods. They dubbed him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, a small, quiet man who struck Faustian bargains and possessed the chilling capability to outsmart the richest man in America, turn a failing railroad into his personal financial laboratory, and walk away with a fortune greater than ever before. But the victory demanded a steep price. His name had become permanently synonymous with trickery and systemic manipulation. Trust was a currency he had intentionally depreciated and would never earn back. As he stood in the makeshift Jersey City hideout, surrounded by towering stacks of freshly printed Erie stock, the paper manifestation of his dubious success. Gould must have known the game was only escalating. The railroads were merely the proving grounds. Jay was about to fix his sights on a prize infinitely grander, infinitely more volatile: gold, the fundamental lifeblood of the American economy. And when Jay Gould moved on gold, the shockwaves would ripple across the entire country. But for a mind that operated like a restless engine, the mastery of a single railroad was merely a localized triumph. Gould understood that as long as the nation's currency remained untethered to a fixed standard, the true lever of the American economy lay not in the iron of the tracks, but in the glint of the gold exchange. It is 1869, and Jay Gould, now 33, is riding an intoxicating high, or at least as high as a financial pirate can, when half of New York society dreams of his public humiliation. The Erie War made him infamous, a financial prodigy, a wonderkind with a preternatural ability to convert systemic chaos into personal profit. The Erie Railroad, though battered and constantly mired in legal battles, was now a functional cash machine, held together by a potent combination of selective bribes and pure, unadulterated bravado. But Gould was not content to play in the regional mud of railroads. He sought something shinier, something that could fundamentally shake the pillars of American commerce. Gold. Welcome to the wildest gamble of his life. A scheme so audacious, it could make the most hardened speculator blush. The United States in 1869 was still recovering from the Civil War. Its economy was still largely fueled by greenbacks, fiat paper money, unbacked by specie, a necessary but unstable relic of wartime desperation. Gold itself was physically scarce, hoarded by international banks and elite speculators. Traded on the frenetic New York Gold Exchange, like the manifestation of a collective fever dream. Its price volatility was immense, affecting the cost of every commodity. From Nebraska wheat to naval warship, the man who could control the supply of gold could, in essence, control the entire market. Jay Gould, applying his surveyor's precision and his hustler's icy nerve, saw the opportunity to do just that. To pull off such an operation, he needed more than just capital. He needed absolute political immunity. His essential co-conspirator was Jim Fisk, his bombastic partner from the Erie War. Fisk was Gould's perfect foil, loud, garish, and utterly devoted to champagne and chorus girls. Where Gould calculated in utter silence, Fisk performed for the crowd, wearing his staggering ambition like a peacock displays its feathers. Together, they were a terrifying synergy, a serpent and a lion sharing a cage. To ensure absolute control, they needed more than just a direct line to the president. They needed a mechanism. Gould quietly bought a controlling interest in the 10th National Bank to use as a personal printing press for certified checks. Even more audaciously, they compromised the Treasury itself, bribing Assistant Treasurer Daniel Butterfield with a $10,000 check and a $1.5 million stake in the gold pool to tip them off the moment the government decided to sell. Their objective was breathtakingly simple: corner the gold market, drive the price to a stratospheric peak, and sell out, pocketing tens of millions while the rest of the economy gasped for air. It was not merely about money. It was about demonstrating their power to dictate the terms of the financial world. The first tactical step was mastering the supply. Gold, unlike cotton or coal, was finite and highly centralized, locked away in bank vaults and the U.S. Treasury. Gould and Fisk began buying quietly, using a labyrinthine network of shell brokers to mask their tracks and utilizing borrowed money and Erie Railroad funds. They snapped up gold certificates faster than a boy collecting marbles. By mid-1869, they controlled a substantial percentage of the market. But crucially, not enough to truly squeeze it. To achieve total control, they needed the federal government to stay out of the game. The key rested in the hands of President Ulysses S. Grant, a war hero with a notoriously shaky grasp of complex finance. If Grant ordered the U.S. Treasury to sell its massive gold reserve, the sudden influx of supply would instantly collapse the price, vaporizing Gould's scheme. Here, the plot ventured into the realm of the deliciously unethical. Gould didn't just target mid-level politicians. He aimed for the most intimate form of access. He recruited Abel Corbin, Grant's own brother-in-law, a man with the easy smile of a political functionary and the moral compass of a backroom gambler. Corbin was no financial genius, but he possessed the priceless commodity of proximity to the president. Gould and Fisk wined and dined Corbin relentlessly, smoothly slipping him a substantial stake in their growing gold pool as an irresistible sweetener. Corbin, utterly seduced by the promise of instant wealth and proximity to power, promised to use his influence to ensure Grant would not authorize the sale of the Treasury's gold. Corbin even successfully arranged a tense, private dinner between Jay Gould and the president. The mild-mannered financier sought to charm the gruff old general. Here, we see the terrifying sophistication of Gould's method. He understood that markets don't just run on math, they run on narratives. By selling the president a story about patriotic duty and helping farmers, Gould was engaging in an early form of narrative economics, manipulating the most powerful man in the country not with a bribe, but with a carefully crafted idea that validated Grant's own desire to be a hero. He didn't just rely on charm. He sold Grant a specific economic narrative known as the crop theory. Gould argued that a high price for gold would weaken the dollar, making American wheat cheaper for Europe to buy. He convinced the president that withholding government gold wasn't speculation, but a patriotic duty to help Western farmers export their harvest. Gould left the meeting profoundly unsure if he had genuinely won the man over. But he was not one to wait for official permission. He proceeded as if the fix were absolute. The gold price continued its relentless climb. Gould and Fisk maintained their clandestine buying, pushing the price from $130 to $140 an ounce. Wall Street began to sweat. Merchants, farmers, and factory owners relied on stable gold prices to conduct international trade. As the price spiked, a tangible, suffocating panic crept across the financial district. Gould, sequestered in his anonymous office, meticulously tracked every tick of the market, his notebook filling with numbers that spelled imminent economic chaos for everyone else. Fisk, meanwhile, played the public showman, swaggering around the gold exchange, audaciously boasting about their little operation. The press, sensing a massive story, began calling them the Gold Ring, a moniker that suggested a shadowy, powerful secret society rather than a pair of calculating schemers. Now, a peculiar footnote from this high-pressure period. Jay Gould developed the strange habit of eating raw onions as if they were apples. He claimed the pungent bulbs kept him sharp and focused. Imagine the slight, intense man crunching noisily through a raw onion while plotting the upheaval of the entire national economy. Was it a health fad, a calculated eccentricity, or a deliberate, simple mechanism to keep people physically at arm's length? Whatever the reason, this oddity stripped away some of the machine-like perfection of the myth. He was a human being, with quirks as strange as his financial scheme. By September 1869, the scheme was fully operational, but hairline fractures were appearing. Corbin's assurances regarding Grant grew increasingly weak. Whispers circulated that the president was becoming suspicious of the sudden, unexplained manipulation. Worse, other powerful speculators were catching wind, either jumping into the rising market or betting heavily against Gould and Fisk. The price hurtled past $150, then hit $160, a level that was actively strangling legitimate businesses across the country. Gould knew the clock was ticking down to zero. The immediate release of the Treasury's gold meant instantaneous ruin. On September 24th, 1800 Sextionio, a day forever remembered as Black Friday, Jay made his move. He and Fisk pushed the price to $162, an unprecedented, unsustainable high. The gold exchange exploded into a madhouse of shouting, sweating brokers shoving to complete transactions before the inevitable break. Then came the disaster. Word leaked, perhaps hours before the official announcement, that President Grant had ordered the Treasury to release $4 million in government gold onto the market. The news hit the exchange floor like a cannonball, shattering the fragile market confidence. Gold prices plummeted instantaneously, dropping to $135 in minutes. Brokers were ruined on the spot. Businesses collapsed, and ordinary citizens watched their life savings evaporate in a heartbeat. Fisk, ever the theatrical performer, feigned absolute shock and innocence. But Gould, he had been the silent architect of his own escape. While Jim Fisk was still frantically screaming orders in the gold room, buying at the very peak, Gould had been quietly unloading his holdings since the opening bell. He used his own partner as a human shield, letting Fisk's boisterous buying mask his own systematic retreat. How did he know? Some historians suggest a frantic, last-minute telegram from Corbin served as the deadly tip-off. Others simply cite Gould's chillingly accurate instinct for survival. While others were ruined, Gould had escaped. Though the ensuing avalanche of lawsuits would tie up his gains for years, some historians argue he barely broke even. He had achieved the impossible. He was the only one to walk out of the burning building he had set on fire, his empire intact. The ensuing political fallout was brutal. Congress hauled the pair before lawmakers, but they dodged and weaved with practiced ease, claiming they were merely speculating, not conspiring. While Corbin was disgraced and President Grant retreated in embarrassment, the public fury focused on one man. Newspapers depicted Gould as a sociopath, a predator willing to crash the national economy just to balance his personal ledger. But Jay Gould did not flinch. He had his millions, his Erie railroad, and one absolute lesson etched into his mind. power always comes at a price, and he was demonstrably willing to pay it. As the dust settled, he was already searching for the next game, one that would take him deeper into the heart of American industrial infrastructure. Black Friday had secured Jay Gould's status as a household name, albeit one you certainly wouldn't invite for tea. By 1870, he was 34. His name whispered with an equal mix of awe and palpable loathing. The gold scheme had netted him a staggering sum, but it also painted a massive target on his back. Wall Street officially called him a pirate, a robber baron, a man who would sell his own soul if the bid was high enough. Gould cared nothing for popularity contests. He had the Erie Railroad, a fortified war chest of cash, and a mind that operated 3 steps ahead of every competitor. He was ready to stop playing the game and start owning the arena itself. Armed with the spoils of his golden conquest and a reputation that made men tremble, Gould turned his gaze back to the frontier where his journey began, realizing that to truly own the arena, he must control the very tracks upon which the nation moved. The early 1870s marked the absolute golden age for railroads, and particularly for the men who controlled their tracks. America was expanding relentlessly westward, and railroads were the essential, thrumming arteries of progress, hauling coal, cattle, and ambition across the continent. But the business was brutal. Companies overbuilt, stocks crashed, and executives often looted their own firms like pirates abandoning a sinking ship. Gould, still running the Erie with Jim Fisk, saw this chaos as his ideal canvas. He wasn't content managing one railroad. He wanted to dominate the network entirely, weaving a web of interconnected lines that would choke out competitors and render him untouchable. His first move was to solidify control at the Erie. The line remained a financial mess, bleeding cash from ongoing mismanagement and the residual trauma of the Black Friday crash. Gould, with his surgical knack for numbers, began cleaning house. This wasn't altruism, but a clear business imperative. A sinking ship doesn't pay dividends. He implemented ruthless cost-cutting, initiated necessary track repairs, and negotiated aggressive freight rates. Yet, he continued his old tricks, selectively issuing new stock to raise quick cash and dilute the holdings of persistent enemies on the board. Then, tragedy struck the inner circle, or what passed for tragedy in Gould's icy world. In January 1872, Jim Fisk was shot dead in a grand New York hotel. The assailant was not a business rival, but a jealous partner of a jilted lover. Fisk, the eternally flamboyant showman, had become entangled in a notorious triangle involving a woman named Josie Mansfield. Her other suitor, Edward Stokes, decided to settle the score with a pistol. Fisk's death was a genuine blow to Gould, though not for sentimental reasons. Gould rarely indulged in warm sentimentality. Fisk had been an invaluable, noisy ally, a public distraction, who happily absorbed the world's attention, while Gould meticulously worked his calculations in the shadows. Now, Gould was alone at the Erie's helm, and the sharks began to circle the scent of blood. Fisk's sensational murder also sparked a PR catastrophe. The already hostile press depicted Gould as the true villain, subtly accusing him of driving Fisk to financial and moral ruin. Investors, spooked by the scandal and the sudden lack of a public face, began dumping Erie stock in massive under intense pressure. Gould executed a strategic retreat, officially stepping down as Erie's president in 1872, while he retained massive influence. The Erie was beginning to feel like a small, regional pond for a man of his colossal appetite. Yet, in the absence of Fisk's flamboyant intuition and public shielding, Gould found himself vulnerable within a social minefield where his cold logic was no match for a master of human vanity. This blind spot led to a humiliating twist. The master manipulator fell for the charms of Lord Gordon, a bogus British aristocrat who scammed him out of $1 million in stock. When the truth emerged, Gould's predatory instincts overreached. Instead of suing, he attempted to kidnap Gordon in Canada, sparking an international diplomatic incident. It was the rare, jagged moment where the shark truly became the bait. This bizarre episode serves as a humbling reminder that even the Mephistopheles of Wall Street had a fatal flaw: his own greed. Gould wanted total control of the Erie so badly that he suspended his legendary cynicism, proving a timeless psychological truth. The con man is often the easiest mark because he believes he is too smart to be fooled. Gould's next target was the Union Pacific Railroad, one of America's greatest rail networks, stretching from Omaha to the Pacific coast. The Union Pacific Railroad was a profound national symbol, built with enormous government subsidies and fueled by the dreams of manifest destiny. But by the early 1870s, it was a financial disaster, riddled with debt and corruption from its construction era. Gould saw opportunity in the wreckage, but not just to loot. Here, the Mephistopheles showed a new face. The builder. He didn't just manipulate the stock. He rebuilt the railroad. He ruthlessly cut costs, developed massive coal mines along the route to fuel his trains cheaply, and turned a pile of rusting iron into a profitable machine. It was a paradox that baffled his critics. The great destroyer was becoming a great manager. He began buying Union Pacific stock with his characteristic quiet stealth, utilizing multiple proxies to mask his aggregation of shares. By 1873, he was the major shareholder, subtly whispering in the ears of the board and ruthlessly pushing for executive control. The Union Pacific was not the Erie. It was a nationally watched giant, constantly monitored by Congress and the press. Gould's notorious reputation preceded him, and investors were deeply wary. To succeed, he required clean-named allies. He found one in Sidney Dillon, a seasoned railroad veteran. Together, they relentlessly overhauled the Union Pacific, streamlining operations and aggressively boosting profitability. Gould was never above cutting a corner. He manipulated stock prices and pressured smaller lines into selling out. But he also demonstrated a genuine genius for strategy, transforming the Union Pacific Railroad into a far leaner, meaner machine. But as the tracks of the Union Pacific stretched toward the horizon, the walls of Gould's private world began to close in, proving that an empire of iron is a heavy burden for a man of flesh. Here, a strange detail surfaces. Jay Gould, despite his rapidly accumulating wealth, lived with jarring modesty. Paranoia became his constant shadow. Terrified of assassination, Gould hired the famous Inspector Thomas Burns as a personal bodyguard and turned his commute into a security operation, traveling by his private yacht at Atlanta to avoid the exposed streets of New York. He found solace only in his greenhouse, tending to his orchids, delicate flowers that required the same total control he exerted over the economy. This image of the tubercular tycoon tending to fragile orchids offers a final, haunting lesson on the price of ambition. He had conquered Wall Street, but he lived in a prison of his own making, wealthy beyond imagination, yet too fearful to walk the streets of the city he owned. It poses the question, is it truly success if you have to build a fortress to enjoy it? While other tycoons of the Gilded Age erected obscene Fifth Avenue mansions, he and his wife, Helen, remained in a respectable, yet conspicuously unflashy, New York townhouse. He often walked to work, typically alone, his coat sometimes appearing threadbare despite his millions. Was this genuine frugality, a calculated desire to stay invisible, or simply the trait of a man who cared far more about controlling power than possessing outward pomp? Whatever the reason, it served as a powerful reminder that Gould was an atypical robber baron. He didn't need gold-plated carriages to feel like a king. By 1873, Gould's empire was dramatically expanding, but the economic ground beneath the nation was shaking. The U.S. economy was wildly overheating, fueled by reckless railroad speculation and unstable banks. Gould, ever the opportunist, sensed the impending trouble before almost anyone else. He began aggressively diversifying, pulling vast sums of capital out of volatile railroads and moving them into safer investments like real estate and high-grade bonds. It was a preternaturally smart move. For in September 1873, the panic of 1873 struck like a devastating tidal wave. The collapse of the prominent banking house of J. Cook and Company triggered a chain reaction. Banks failed, stocks plummeted, and dozens of railroads went bankrupt. The Union Pacific itself tottered, but Gould's quick, preemptive maneuvers kept it financially afloat, cementing his reputation as a man who thrived, even prospered, in absolute chaos. This phase of his career challenges the one-dimensional view of Gould as merely a robber. While his methods of acquisition were predatory, his management was shockingly modern. He integrated systems, cut inefficiencies, and understood the power of the network effect a century before the internet. It proves a comfortable truth. that a villain can sometimes build just as effectively as a hero. The panic was a national disaster for millions. But for Gould, it was simply another reinforcing lesson. Empires are not constructed on flimsy concepts like loyalty or trust, but upon raw financial leverage and impeccable timing. As he surveyed the economic wreckage of 1873, he was already plotting his next grand move, one that would take him beyond railroads entirely, straight into the heart of America's burgeoning communication network. The man who had cornered Gould and outsmarted the Commodore was about to discover a game that would make him both more powerful and more deeply hated than ever before. For Gould, the panic of 1873 had proven that controlling the tracks was only half the battle. To truly dominate a continent, one had to control the speed at which its heart beat, the flow of information that dictated every price, every deal, and every panic across the nation. It is 1874, and Jay Gould is a man who has seen the top of the mountain and determined it simply wasn't high enough. The panic of 1873 had left America reeling. Factories shuttered, families penniless, and thousands of miles of railroad tracks rusting. But Gould, now 38, emerged unscathed, his fortune intact thanks to his Erie knack for dodging disaster. The Union Pacific was humming under his direction. The Erie remained his private playground, and his name was a byword for financial cunning. But Gould was not one to rest on his laurels, or whatever passes for laurels in a world built on stock tickers and clandestine payoffs. His next target was the telegraph, the literal nervous system of the Gilded Age, a prize that would make his previous railroad games look like child's play. In the 1870s, the telegraph was a marvel, a lightning-fast network of copper wires carrying critical messages across the continent in minutes. It was the absolute backbone of commerce, allowing merchants to track shifting prices, generals to move armies, and newspapers to scoop their rivals. Western Union, the largest telegraph company, was a near monopoly, controlling thousands of miles of wire and millions in revenue. But it was vulnerable. Its stock had been battered by the panic, and its management was bloated with complacent overconfidence. Gould, sensing the weakness, realized that if he could control Western Union, he could control information itself, a power even the mighty Vanderbilt had never dreamed of wielding. Gould's plan was classic, quiet, meticulously calculated, and utterly ruthless. He began buying Western Union stock in 1874, utilizing layers of shell companies and proxies to evade detection. The market was still shaky, and shares were cheap, a genuine bargain for a man with Gould's cash reserves. But Western Union's board was tough, led by powerful figures like William Orton, who viewed Jay Gould as a financial vulture in a black frock coat. To breach the fortress, Gould needed a wedge. He found it in the form of a weaker rival, the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, A&P. It was smaller, financially brittle, but it offered him a foothold. Gould bought outright control of A&P, not to operate it efficiently, but to use it as a powerful battering ram against the Goliath, Western Union. His strategy was a masterclass in corporate warfare. Instead of buying Western Union directly, he built a fake rival called American Union, started a brutal price war to bleed the giant dry, and drove their stock into the ground. Only then, when Western Union was on its knees, did he merge the company, effectively buying the monopoly at a discount. In modern business terms, this is the ultimate spoiler strategy. Gould demonstrated that you don't always have to build a better product to win. Sometimes, it is far cheaper and more effective to simply wound your competitor, bleed their stock price dry with a price war, and then buy the wreckage for pennies on the dollar. It was destruction as a form of acquisition. The strategy was brutally simple: drastically undercut Western Union's rates, poach its most valuable customers, and drive its stock into the dirt. Gould slashed A&P's prices, offering telegraph service at a temporary loss to aggressively lure business. Western Union was forced to fight back, cutting its own rates, initiating a devastating war of attrition. A war Jay knew he had the deeper pockets to win. He also played dirty, spreading destabilizing rumors about Western Union's finances and leaning heavily on his political allies to obstruct any of their expansion efforts. By 1876, Western Union's stock was wobbling badly as Gould inched inexorably toward control, a slow, grinding process that demanded the kind of endless patience he reserved for the nation's information stream. This relentless pursuit of absolute power however, came at a staggering psychological cost that followed him home long after the stock tickers grew silent. While his residence with Helen and their 4 children served as a quiet domestic oasis, the shadow of his public wars stretched across the threshold. Even within this sanctuary, the strain was evident. Helen's steady management of the household could not entirely mask the toll taken by Jay's long hours, constant scrutiny, and the ever-growing legion of enemies. One peculiar story from this time relates that Gould, a chronic insomniac, would often pace his study late into the night, murmuring long strings of numbers, or immersing himself in history books about strategic conquerors like Napoleon. Was he dreaming of conquest, or simply trying to outrun the relentless ticking of his own restless, calculating mind? It was a reminder that even titans possessed strange, human quirks. Back to the Telegraph War. By 1877, Western Union was feeling the critical heat. Orton, the president, died unexpectedly, leaving the corporation momentarily leaderless and vulnerable. Jay seized the precise moment. Using his A&P leverage to force an immediate deal, he sold A&P to Western Union at an inflated price, but with a crucial catch. He secured a powerful seat on the board and a massive, controlling block of stock. It was a flawless masterstroke. By 1878, Gould was effectively running Western Union. Even though he permitted others to hold the public titles, the information monopoly was his, and with it, the absolute power to set rates, control the flow of commercial messages, and subtly shape the dissemination of information nationwide. This victory was about far more than just money. It was about reach. Western Union's wires connected banks, railroads, and major newspapers, giving Gould a front-row seat to America's deepest financial secrets. He instantly knew who was buying, who was selling, and who was poised to go bankrupt. It was an inexhaustible goldmine of insider information, and Gould was never above using it. He traded stocks based on private telegraph reports, stayed ahead of every major market swing, and quietly, vastly expanded his personal fortune. The press, predictably, howled in protest, calling him a monopolist, a man who would wiretap the entire nation for $1. Gould merely shrugged. In his universe, information was not merely power. It was the highest form of profit. The telegraph takeover cemented Jay Gould's status as an undeniable titan, but it also painted an even larger target on his back. Regulators began sniffing around, and Congress intensified talk of breaking up monopolies. Gould, the consummate chess player, stayed one step ahead, rapidly diversifying his investments into new areas, newspapers, immense tracts of real estate, and even a steamship line. He was no longer just a railroad man or a telegraph baron. He was a one-man conglomerate, a shadow empire whose tendrils reached into every single corner of American commercial life. But empires attract enemies, and Gould had more than most. As he tightened his grip on Western Union, a new breed of players entered the game, men who had observed and learned from his ruthless playbook, and were not afraid to fight, even dirtier. The Gilded Age was swiftly changing, and Jay Gould would need every ounce of his legendary cunning to remain on the summit. Little did he know, his biggest battles were yet to come, battles that would test not just his calculating mind, but the very depths of his soul. By 1880, Jay Gould was 44, a man at the absolute zenith of his powers. Though physically, you wouldn't guess it, he was still slight, almost frail, with a face that seemed more suited to a country preacher than a titan of industry. Yet, appearances were profoundly deceptive. Gould had constructed an empire spanning railroads, telegraphs, and the deep-seated fears of every financier in New York. Western Union was his crown jewel, the Erie, his loyal warhorse, and his total fortune was conservatively estimated at $50 million, a sum that could purchase entire cities. Yet, for all his staggering wealth, Gould's life was a precarious tightrope, perpetually balanced between triumph and the ever-present threat of total ruin. Gould's rise to this financial zenith was not an isolated triumph. It was the sharpest peak in a landscape of jagged social contrasts that defined the era. The Gilded Age was in full, roaring swing, a time of glittering, often obscene excess contrasting sharply with crushing urban poverty. New York's streets were a study in contrast. Palatial mansions rose on Fifth Avenue, while tenements festered downtown. Gould, now a permanent fixture in this landscape, moved through it like a ghost. He studiously avoided the lavish balls and ostentatious yacht races favored by rivals like J.P. Morgan. Instead, he worked, always worked. His modest office functioning as a fortress of intricate ledgers and constantly ticking telegrams. His enemies labeled him a spider, meticulously weaving webs to entrap the unwary. His few trusted allies called him a genius. The truth, as always, resided in the complex gray area between. Gould was not evil for the sake of it. He simply viewed the world as a vast, complex machine, and he was absolutely determined to be the one pulling all the essential levers. With Western Union firmly under his thumb, Gould returned his attention to the railroads. The industry was consolidating rapidly, with giants like the Union Pacific and Northern Pacific swallowing smaller lines whole. Gould, never one to miss a trend he could exploit, began building a new, truly continental railroad empire. He bought controlling interest in the Missouri Pacific MoPac, a sprawling, ambitious network that stretched from St. Louis deep into the developing territories of Texas. It was a bold, high-risk move. The MoPac was profitable but unwieldy. With thousands of miles of track tangled in a mountain of old debts, Gould dove in, restructuring the colossal company with a surgeon's precision. He drastically cut jobs, renegotiated onerous contracts, and, yes, relentlessly manipulated the stock to keep all potential investors guessing. But Gould was no longer just playing offense. He now faced formidable enemies on every side, from rival tycoons to federal regulators who began sniffing around his communication monopolies. The press remained relentlessly hostile, painting him as the devil incarnate. One famous cartoon from the era depicted Jay Gould as a grotesque vulture perched atop a telegraph pole, clutching bulging bags of gold coins while starving farmers collapsed beneath him. The image was undeniably powerful, but it missed the crucial context. One fascinating detail from this period underscores his complex persona. Gould was fiercely obsessed with privacy. He almost never granted interviews and avoided photographers like a plague. On one occasion, when a persistent reporter managed to snap his picture, Gould reportedly purchased the photographic plate and the negative immediately, destroying them both. Was this vanity, paranoia, or just the calculated instinct of a man who knew the existential value of remaining in the shadows? Whatever the reason, it only added to his mystique, transforming him less into a man and more into a myth, a name whispered fearfully in both boardrooms and crowded barrooms alike. Yet, while Gould could erase his image from the newspapers, he could not vanish from the sight of a public that increasingly viewed his silent power as a threat to their survival. The Missouri Pacific became Gould's new overriding obsession, but it came with massive political risks. The railroad was a political lightning rod, with farmers and shippers accusing it of widespread price gouging. In 1881, a powerful populist movement, known as the Granger Laws, gained critical traction, pushing for aggressive government regulation of railroad rates. Gould, who had spent years bribing legislators to ensure they stayed out of his business, now faced a new, terrifying threat. A mobilized public fed up with men like him. He fought back ferociously, hiring battalions of lawyers to challenge the laws in court and lobbying Congress tirelessly to keep regulators at bay. It was a war he could not afford to lose. If the government began successfully dictating freight rates, the fundamental profitability of his entire empire would crumble. At home, Jay's life remained quieter, though no less complex. Helen, his absolute rock, was now raising their 6 children, carefully shielding them from the torrent of venom aimed at their infamous father. The Goulds were wealthy, but they cultivated an air of calculated restraint. Their Fifth Avenue brownstone, though substantial, lacked the garish marble halls and European affectations favored by the Vanderbilts and Astors. It was a home designed for comfort and privacy, a fortress against the venomous outside world. In this cocoon, Jay spent his evenings transforming from the Mephistopheles of Wall Street into a quiet, exacting father. He taught his sons the brutal geometry of chess, demanding focus and foresight, or read ancient history aloud. Using the fall of empires as quiet lessons in leverage and betrayal, it was a side of Jay Gould, a man who cherished his family above all things, that the public was never allowed to witness. Yet, even in the stillness of his study, tension brewed. His eldest son, George, was growing into a young man with a dangerous glint of ambition in his eyes. Jay watched him closely, wondering whether he was cultivating a successor who would secure the dynasty or raising a rival capable of tearing it down. But as Gould tightened his grip on the nation's infrastructure, he found that owning the tracks and the wires was not enough to guarantee peace. A new force was rising from the oil fields of Pennsylvania, one that didn't just want to use his railroad, but intended to dictate the terms of their very existence. By 1882, the Gould Empire was undeniably at its zenith, a sprawling, profitable network of steel rails and copper wires. But the cracks were forming beneath the surface. Jay's health, never robust, began its slow, inevitable retreat. The cough, a dry, persistent reminder of the tuberculosis that had plagued him in his youth, returned with new vigor. The relentless stress of battling rivals, the burgeoning power of regulators, and the ceaseless barrage of the press compounded the affliction. Driven by a profound restlessness that no amount of fortune could quell, Jay pressed on. He began strategically diversifying, buying up prime Manhattan real estate and investing heavily in the Manhattan Elevated Railway, a skeletal network that would become the backbone of the city's rapid transit. It was a move born of foresight. Urban transit was the future, and Jay knew the volatile, frontier days of the railroad game were drawing to a close. Then, a new titan emerged from the Pennsylvania oil fields, John D. Rockefeller. The Oil King's Standard Oil was not just a company, it was a revolution, systematically rewriting the rules of American business through ruthless efficiency and absolute consolidation. Rockefeller's empire depended entirely on the railroads to ship his massive volume of oil to ports and refineries. He wanted control of the freight lines, and he was absolutely unafraid of confrontation. Gould, sensing a fight that went beyond mere stock manipulation, started maneuvering to protect his turf, primarily the vital lines of the Missouri Pacific. It was a clash preordained by the era, the schemer versus the systemizer, testing every brutal trick in Jay's playbook. The trouble started not with shouting, but with ledgers. Rockefeller demanded deep, unmatchable discounts, arguing his oil was the lifeblood of Gould's roots. Gould, never one to concede leverage, pushed back by charging premium rate, determined to maximize every possible dollar of profit. This was not personal, at least not initially. It was pure, unadulterated, Gilded Age capitalism. But Rockefeller, unlike Gould's previous targets, did not negotiate. He annihilated. He responded by diverting capital into the construction of parallel pipelines, a monumental infrastructure project designed to bypass Gould's railroads entirely. Jay retaliated with the scorched earth tactics that had made him infamous. He slashed rates on his lines, triggering a vicious price war that bled profits from both empires. Worse, he used the vast intelligence network of Western Union, leveraging its position to intercept telegrams and track Rockefeller's strategic moves. Ethics were about as common as humility in that age, and Jay dispensed with them easily. He spread crippling rumors about Standard Oil's finances to spook investors and even leaned on old political connections, including the now disgraced but still connected Boss Tweed network, to block Rockefeller's pipeline permits in Washington. The war escalated throughout 1884 as Jay began buying feeder railroads to choke Rockefeller's supply lines, even dabbling in oil production to step directly into the lion's den. Yet, this exhausting cycle of industrial warfare demanded a private escape, a place where Gould's predatory focus shifted toward a more fragile kind of dominance. Within the sanctuary of his home, fleeting glimpses of vulnerability emerged. His cough, a constant and exhausting companion, signaled the tuberculosis he stubbornly ignored in favor of his ledgers. While doctors warned of the toll, Helen remained his unshakable anchor, maintaining the family's equilibrium amidst the gathering storms of his public life. One peculiar detail: despite his immense power, Jay cultivated a meticulous fascination with orchids. He maintained a small, tropical greenhouse at his residence, spending late nights tending to the exotic, fragile flowers. Picture the cold-eyed tycoon, hands stained with soil, obsessing over petals that required absolute, controlled environments. Was it a hobby, a distraction, or simply a way to command a world that didn't fight back? By 1885, the stalemate was costing both men Hundreds of thousands, sensing the turning tide and recognizing the impracticality of eternal war, Jay made a surprising, pragmatic move. He offered a truce. They met discreetly in New York, not to surrender, but to formalize a division of spoils. The resulting deal was simple and ruthless. Jay guaranteed deeply favorable rates for Standard Oil, and Rockefeller agreed to prioritize Gould's railroads for his massive freight volumes. It was not friendship. It was the mutual acknowledgement that continuous, destructive conflict was foolish. The truce held, allowing Gould to shift focus, doubling down on Western Union's dominance while eyeing new ventures, including steamships and mining. But the landscape was darkening. The Gilded Age was attracting vultures, regulators and reformers who were beginning to circle. By 1886, Jay Gould was 50, and his name sparked fear and revulsion in equal measure. Though his empire was robust, public hostility was reaching a boiling point. Labor unions, sensing the public's rising fury against monopolies, began to target the railroads. The powerful Knights of Labor accused Jay of gouging farmers and brutalizing employees. The inevitable arrived. A massive strike on the Missouri Pacific shut down tracks across 3 states. Workers demanded living wages and shorter hours. Gould's response was immediate and savage. He hired private detective agencies, mercenaries equipped with billy clubs and rifles, to break the strike by force. Trains started rolling again, but not without bloodshed. While Gould saw labor merely as a variable cost to be minimized, history remembers the human toll. The calculated destruction of Union leaders like Martin Irons reveals the dark underbelly of the Gilded Age. It was an era where industrial efficiency was often purchased at the price of basic human empathy, and where the freedom of the market included the freedom to starve one's opponents. The brutality extended beyond the picket lines. Gould targeted the strike leader, Martin Irons, with a vengeance that ruined the man's life. Through his control of the press and industry connections, Gould ensured Irons was blacklisted and smeared as a dangerous radical. Irons died penniless and broken, a chilling example of what happened when you crossed the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. For Gould, the destruction of a man's livelihood was merely another calculated entry in his ledger, a reality he could detach from as easily as stepping into the golden light of a Broadway stage. The backlash was catastrophic. Newspapers, already hostile, ran horrifying front-page stories detailing the violence inflicted by Gould's goons. Political cartoons depicted Jay not just as a robber baron, but as a bloated, vampiric spider, clutching bags of gold while starving families wept below. During the height of the crisis, Jay was spotted at a New York theater, apparently absorbed in a light comedy. When confronted by associates about the timing, he merely shrugged, indifferent to the carnage he had caused. "My concern is the dividend, not the headlines," he reportedly said. This blind spot, his total lack of concern for public opinion, was perhaps his greatest flaw. The man who could outmaneuver Vanderbilt seemed genuinely baffled by the idea that people valued dignity over profit. The public anger fueled political action. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, a new federal law designed to regulate railroad rates and curb abuse, was a direct shot at men like Jay. Though riddled with loopholes, it was a terrifying sign of things to come. Gould fought back by pouring money into lobbying and, crucially, by attempting to corner the narrative. He snapped up control of several major metropolitan newspapers, including the New York World, effectively buying silence and a platform for self-promotion. He was fighting not just for profit, but for control of his own reputation. At home, his health was now undeniably failing. His writing to his children became more urgent, culminating in a chilling message that summarized his life's philosophy. Trust no one, but family. Gould had spent a lifetime building walls, legal, financial, and personal, to protect his interests from a hostile world. But by 1889, he faced an intruder that no amount of lobbying or watered stock could keep at bay: the slow, internal erosion of his own life. By 1889, Jay Gould was a man living on borrowed time. At 53, his body was betraying him. Tuberculosis, a cold, constant shadow, yet his empire was stronger than ever, worth an estimated $70 million, sprawling across railroads, telegraphs, real estate, and profitable mining ventures. The Fifth Avenue home remained his sanctuary. Helen managed the 6 children with quiet fortitude, maintaining an atmosphere of calm that belied the storms raging outside. Evenings were sacred. Gould, coughing into a linen handkerchief, would spend hours teaching young George the intricacies of financial manipulation, or sharing his collection of rare coins, Spanish doubloons, Roman denarii, telling his children stories of empires that had risen and fallen. Was it a lesson in history, or a warning about the fleeting nature of power? George, now 25 and deeply involved in the Missouri Pacific, was the heir apparent, but his ambition veered toward recklessness, worrying Jay, who feared that George's flash might undo his patient. Long-term scheming, the world outside was closing in. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, though toothless initially, was a clear threat. Jay's old rival Rockefeller, through sheer efficiency, was pulling ahead, and J.P. Morgan, the ruthless financier, was consolidating railroads into leviathans that threatened Jay's dominance. Jay responded by tightening his grip on Western Union. Using its intelligence to anticipate Morgan's moves, he also began diversifying frantically, buying into steel and coal to hedge against the impending regulation of the railroad industry. By 1891, Jay's health was critical. Doctors ordered strict bed rest, but he scoffed, maintaining a furious work pace from his study, the room cluttered with maps, ledgers, and telegrams. He was planning one last grand railroad merger, a desperate attempt to create a transcontinental empire that could truly rival Morgan's burgeoning control. He was still fighting, driven by a force that transcended mere wealth. He was fighting for survival, for legacy, for the right to prove that the Spider of Wall Street could not only conquer industries, but cheat mortality itself. But his body was fading faster than his ambition, and the weight of his cursed name was finally beginning to drag him down. The end was near, but Jay Gould, the schemer who had tamed the nation's tracks and wires, did not intend to go quietly. He simultaneously pushed forward with the expansion of his Manhattan Elevated Railway, a labyrinth of iron and steam he believed guaranteed him a stake in New York City's unstoppable vertical ascent. But this final entrepreneurial surge was shadowed by the undeniable strain of his failing health and rising opposition. The first significant fissure appeared in 1891 when major strikes paralyzed his rail lines. Workers, emboldened by mounting economic injustice, demanded fair wages and conditions. Jay, a man whose instinct had always been to crush opposition with uncompromising force, was now physically too frail to sustain a protracted battle. In a rare and calculated concession, he negotiated rather than fought, offering immediate raises and improving contracts to quell the unrest. It was a tactical retreat, a sign of vulnerability. His enemies immediately noted. Jay knew the cost of labor chaos was now higher than the cost of a raise. He could not afford another front-page story detailing industrial warfare. His antagonists, J.P. Morgan, the increasingly assertive regulators, and the perpetually hostile press, were not merely watching. They were circling, waiting for the schemer's final misstep. As the brutal New York winter set in, Jay's health spiraled rapidly. Doctors delivered the chilling verdict. Months, perhaps less. He dismissed their warnings with characteristic contempt, relentlessly driving his team toward the massive railroad merger he envisioned. But his body, ravaged by tuberculosis, was betraying his will. Helen, his daughter and confidant, pleaded for rest. Yet Jay could not stop. The vast empire, the railroads, the telegraphs, the mines, was not just wealth. It was the tangible evidence of a lifetime spent in battle, the only shield against oblivion. A profound, haunting question began to surface in the silences between his coughing fits. What was it all for? This question lingered as he plotted his ultimate maneuver, a desperate bid to solidify his name and outlast his rivals. But the clock, once his willing accomplice, was now his enemy. It was the spring of 1892, and Jay Gould was a man staring into the abyss. At 56, he was a skeletal figure. His once piercing eyes, dulled by the fever, his Fifth Avenue mansion, a fortress of wealth, now echoed with the constant, rasping sound of his cough. His colossal empire, generating fortunes that could ransom small kingdoms, seemed to mock the mortality of its owner. The Gilded Age was a merciless arena, and the vultures, regulators, rival tycoons, and the spectral figure of death were closing in. Yet, the fight was not done. Drawing on the last reserves of his strength, Jay planned one final grand play, a merger designed to cement his legacy and secure his family from the wolves he had spent his life outrunning. His flagship, the Missouri Pacific, was under siege. The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was aggressively cracking down, demanding transparent rates and threatening unprecedented fines. While his army of lawyers fought the rising tide of government oversight, J.P. Morgan's vast railroad consolidation was relentlessly squeezing Jay's network, forcing him to compete against giants, backed by Wall Street's deepest pockets. Jay's response was audacious, a daring merger linking the Missouri Pacific with crucial southern and western lines to forge a new network spanning half the continent. It was an undertaking that demanded millions in capital, ruthless political finesse, and the operational precision of a military campaign. For Jay, this was no longer about maximizing profit. It was a battle for the very survival of his house. To pull it off, he leaned heavily on Western Union, utilizing its nationwide telegraph lines to coordinate complex deals in real time and track Morgan's shadowy moves. He funneled massive silver and copper revenues from his mining profits directly into the merger fund. It was a high-stakes gamble, and Jay was running entirely on fumes. His days were confined to his opulent study, surrounded by ledgers and a constant stream of coded telegrams. His nights were punctuated by agonizing coughing fits that left his family sleepless. In a poignant, almost absurd detail, Jay had developed a fixation on chamomile tea, convinced the simple farmer's remedy soothed his burning lungs. His sophisticated servants, accustomed to the finest French brandies, found it darkly amusing. A man who could buy entire tea plantations reduced to sipping a humble palliative. Was it hope, or merely the desperation of a man who refused to relinquish control over his own decline? The merger negotiations were a brutal slog. Jay cajoled railroad owners, bribing where necessary, charming where he could still muster the energy. Simultaneously, he was engaged in a silent war with Morgan, who was quietly accumulating shares in Jay's lines, positioning for a hostile takeover. Jay countered with the dirty tricks that had defined his career, issuing new stock to dilute Morgan's stake, and strategically planting rumors to tank rival shares. It was a vicious war fought in smoke-filled boardrooms and back channels, with millions hanging in the balance. The press, as always, was merciless, with one New York paper branding him the last frantic gasp of a dying dynasty. Jay read the headline, offered a faint shrug, and returned to his ledgers. At home, the stress radiated outward. George, now managing critical sections of the Missouri Pacific, was proving competent but alarmingly impulsive. His risky partnership with a volatile Texas cattle baron made Jay nervous. He saw his own ambition in George, but also the recklessness he himself had learned over decades to temper. Helen, the eldest daughter, was stepping into a quiet leadership role, managing the family's vast charitable giving and exhibiting a surprising talent for public diplomacy, a necessary counterpoint to her father's toxic reputation. Jay's focus, however, remained laser-sharp on George. He wrote his son letters not about quarterly earnings, but about strategy, steeped in the cunning of his life's work. Never show your hand until the bets are called. This was advice from a man who had played every card in the deck, usually dealing himself the aces. Yet, beneath this cold architecture of strategy, there remained a fragment of the boy from Roxbury who still understood beauty, a side he revealed only when the endgame grew clear. A moment of profound quiet pierced the chaos when Jay, too weak for any public appearance, attended a small family gathering. He stunned everyone by sitting down at the piano, a skill he had kept hidden for decades. The tune was a simple, melancholy waltz. For those few minutes, the Fifth Avenue mansion was silent, his children watching a man they barely knew. Jay the human, not the tycoon. Was it a conscious farewell, or merely a fleeting, desperate escape? The merger moved forward, but political pressure was intense. Populist movements were demanding the nationalization of railroads. Jay's extensive lobbying machine kept Congress at bay, but the effort drained both his wealth and his dwindling energy. His owned newspapers relentlessly published stories of his sudden generosity, donations to hospitals and schools, but the skeptical public wasn't fooled. Compounding the strain, an old legal battle over the Manhattan Elevated Railway resurfaced, investors claiming Jay had defrauded them. The case was weak, but the endless procedural grind was another cruel thorn in his side. By the summer of 1892, Jay's health reached a critical stage. He was confined to his home, a makeshift office established in his opulent bedroom, surrounded by stacks of papers and coughing violently into silk handkerchiefs. Doctors gave him weeks, maybe days. Helen was a constant, resolute presence, managing the stream of visitors and shielding him from the hungry reporters camped outside. Yet, Jay kept pushing, dictating telegrams and signing massive contracts, determined to see the merger through. It was no longer about the dollars. It was about leaving behind an empire robust enough for his children to inherit, a name that would not vanish into ignominy. But the body that had carried him through decades of industrial combat was finally giving out, and even Jay Gould could not outsmart death. It was late 1892, and Jay Gould was fading. At 56, he was a husk of the man who had once treated Wall Street like his private monopoly. Tuberculosis had utterly ravaged him, leaving him bedridden, his voice a frail whisper, his frame disturbingly skeletal. Yet, his empire remained a formidable force. Railroads stretching south and west, Western Union's wires humming across the nation, and mines churning out precious metals. The Gilded Age itself was reaching its violent climax, with reformers and regulators tearing at its opulent seams. Jay, though, was fighting to the last. His mind, the machine that had bent the era to his will, raced even as his body failed. The complex railroad merger, his final, desperate gamble, was teetering on the brink. While the Missouri Pacific remained strong, the western lines he needed to integrate were choked with debt and political instability. J.P. Morgan, sensing the terminal weakness, began aggressively buying up shares, poised to snatch control. From his sickbed, Jay fought back, dictating rapid-fire orders to George and his trusted inner circle. He used Western Union to precisely track Morgan's movements, dispatching coded telegrams to allies in Denver and Chicago. It was only a shadow of his old brilliance, but it was enough to hold Morgan at bay. For the moment, the public's hatred remained undiminished. Muckrakers circled like buzzards, publishing scorching articles exposing railroad monopolies and telegraph abuses. Jay's newspapers attempted to whitewash his legacy, but his name had become too toxic. A widely circulated political cartoon depicted him as a dying king, clutching a crown fashioned from dollar bills, while gleeful workers celebrated his demise. Too weak to read much, Jay heard about the cartoon from Helen. He offered a faint, almost spectral smile. "Let them cheer," he murmured. "They'll miss me when I'm gone." It was not arrogance, but the simple, cold knowledge of a man who understood the machinery of the world he had brutally shaped. In a haunting turn, Jay, confined to his room, started writing poetry, not for publication, but scribbled darkly on scraps of discarded paper. The verses were filled with images of lonely trains, echoing shadows, and the finality of the rails. Was he wrestling with his complicated legacy, or merely seeking a private language for his pain? Helen carefully preserved these scraps, a unique, private glimpse into the soul the world had only ever seen as a spider. His children, gathered around him, saw a father they had rarely encountered, a man who, for all his external ruthlessness, loved them fiercely and desperately. George had become the family's unsteady anchor, running the Missouri Pacific with an unpredictable blend of his father's cunning and his own youthful impulsiveness. Jay watched, torn between paternal pride and profound dread. He knew George would inherit the empire, but also the eternal enemies, Morgan, the regulators, the press. The merger faltered completely as Jay's health collapsed. Morgan's relentless financial pressure, combined with critical regulatory hurdles, stalled the final agreements. Jay, too weak for any further resistance, formally handed the operational reins to George, whispering his final piece of strategic advice: "Hold the line, but know when to fold." It was a bittersweet moment, a father passing a torch forged in a lifetime of combat. Knowing the flame would soon be reshaped by different winds, the empire would survive. But not according to Jay's grand design. The Gilded Age was dissolving, and the world was moving on. On December 2nd, 1892, Jay Gould died quietly in his bed, Helen at his side. The end was peaceful, a stark and fitting contrast to the financial and political chaos of his life. Newspapers were predictably merciless. Headlines screamed, The spider is dead. Yet, even his harshest critics begrudgingly acknowledged his singular genius, calling him the architect of modern finance. His staggering fortune, estimated conservatively at $77 million, a colossal sum for the era, was one of the largest in America. But his legacy remained murky, a toxic blend of brilliance, insatiable greed, and mystery. The funeral was small, attended only by family and a handful of loyal lieutenants. The public, however, was morbidly curious. Lining the streets of New York to catch a glimpse of the coffin belonging to the man they had loved to hate, George took charge, vowing to protect the immense holdings. But the world Jay built was already changing drastically. New regulations, burgeoning unions, and the rising power of new titans like Morgan were rewriting the rules of capitalism. Jay's death marked the definitive close of an era, a time when a single individual could effectively bend the industrial nation to his solitary will. With the spider gone, the web began to unravel. Jay Gould had left his children a fortune, but he could not bequeath them the ruthless instinct required to protect it from a changing world. It was 1893, and Jay Gould was gone. Yet his shadow was immense. The Gilded Age, with its glittering excess and grinding poverty, was giving way to the progressive era, a new century defined by reform and regulation. Jay's surviving empire, railroads, telegraphs, mines, and real estate, was now in the hands of his children, led by George, who struggled to navigate a world his father no longer controlled. While George struggled to maintain the empire, Gould's daughter Anna used her inheritance to buy what the family lacked: aristocratic legitimacy. She married the French nobleman Count Bonny de Castellane, trading millions for a title, a move that typified the Gilded Age's desperate crave for status. The massive Gould fortune was divided among Helen and the 6 children. Ultimately, the Gould fortune followed the tragic trajectory of the Gilded Age itself, amassed with ruthless, gritty energy in America, then dissipated in a desperate quest for old-world status in Europe. It suggests that while Jay Gould knew how to conquer an economy, he failed to pass on the discipline required to maintain it. The empire didn't end with a bang, but with a wedding march. George, now at the helm of the Missouri Pacific, was determined to prove himself, but he lacked his father's uncanny foresight. His deals were bold, but often careless, and by late 1893, the devastating financial panic hit, a collapse that dwarfed the Black Friday of 1873. Railroads failed, banks shuttered, and George struggled desperately to keep the disintegrating empire afloat. The Missouri Pacific survived, but it emerged battered and diminished, a wounded relic of a wilder, unregulated time. Western Union also faced mounting challenges as the rapid spread of the telephone began to erode the telegraph monopoly Jay had forged. Helen, the widow, became the family's quiet, moral force, managing the wealth and channeling vast sums into philanthropy. She funded hospitals and schools, tirelessly attempting to soften the notorious Gould name. Helen and Anna became leading social philanthropists, while Edwin and the younger sons took smaller roles in the remaining businesses. The family wealth endured, but the name remained irrevocably stained. The curious detail persisted. Years after Jay's death, a New York library uncovered a book he had donated, inscribed with a personal note: "Knowledge is the only true wealth." It was a strange, almost ironic epitaph for a man who had chased dollars with such merciless ferocity. Jay Gould's legacy remains a complex, dual-edged sword. He financed and built the foundational infrastructure that powered modern America, the railroads that linked the coasts, the telegraphs that annihilated distance. But he achieved this through a ruthless, zero-sum game that left deep, enduring scars. Farmers, workers, and small investors all paid the price for his schemes, from the Erie War to Black Friday. Yet, his defenders, few but fierce, argued he was simply a product of his time, a genius who played the game better than anyone else. Without his unbound ambition, they maintained, America's staggering growth would have been measurably slower, its industrial vision dimmer. By 1900, Morgan's colossal mergers dominated the rails, and Rockefeller's Standard Oil faced monumental antitrust suits. The Gilded Age's spectacular excesses were finally giving way to the progressive era, defined by laws designed to curb monopolies and protect the common worker. Jay's once unrivaled empire was slowly being carved up by the irresistible forces of reform and time. George died in 1923. His fortune, a fraction of his father's. His name less feared than pitied. The other children faded into quiet wealth, their lives a distant echo of Jay's thunder. Yet, Jay's mark endures. The tracks he laid still carry modern trains. The wires he strung still hum with data. His story remains a mirror, reflecting the inherent contradictions of America. Ambition unbound, brilliance unchecked, and a societal cost that still lingers. One final anecdote resonates. Decades after his death, a surveyor in upstate New York discovered an old map signed by a young Jay Gould, drawn with a precise, almost unnatural attention to detail. It served as a stark reminder of the boy who started it all, a boy who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. A world he shaped, for better or worse, using nothing but his own ferocious will. As the century turned, Jay Gould's name faded into history, but his shadow persists. He was no simple hero, and no simple villain, but something far stranger, a man who played the game so supremely well that he fundamentally changed its rules. His life, a whirlwind of furious deals and dark dreams, leaves us with the ultimate question. What does it truly mean to win when the price is everything?